Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go to my review of WCW Super Brawl 1996. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is a street fight match. It is the Nasty Boys versus Public Enemy. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between the Nasty Boys and Public Enemy. Saxon hits Rocco Rock with a chair shot. Nasty Boys were keeping the pace of the match. Knobs then throws Rocco Rock off the apron through a table. Sags then hits a pile driver on Johnny Grunge through a trash can. Knobs then hits a suplex on Rocco through a table. Rocco Rock then goes for a senton off the second balcony but missed and went through a table. Brian Knobs then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are the Nasty Boys. Hats off to the Nasty Boys for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Television Championship. It is Johnny B. Bad versus Diamond Dallas Page. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Johnny B. Bad and DDP, with Johnny B. Bad keeping the pace of the match. Johnny B. Bad ends up hitting a slingshot leg drop on DDP. DDP then hits a DDT on Johnny B. Bad in the middle of the ring. Johnny B. Bad then hits a sunset flip into a roll-up on DDP for a near fall. Johnny then hits a powerbomb on DDP as well. DDP then hits a pancake on Johnny B. Bad for a near fall, but Johnny B. Bad ultimately hits a tombstone pile driver on DDP, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Johnny B. Bad. Hats off to Johnny B. Bad for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Harlem Heat versus Lex Luger and Sting. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Harlem Heat and Lex Luger and Sting. Harlem Heat were keeping the pace of the match, but Sting ends up hitting a stinger splash in the corner. Road Warrior Animal comes down to attack Stevie Ray. Referee doesn't see it. Lex Luger then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Lex Luger and Sting. Hats off to Lex Luger and Sting for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's for the WCW United States Heavyweight Championship. It is Conan versus One Man Gang. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Conan and One Man Gang, with Conan keeping the pace of the match. Conan hits a head scissor takedown on One Man Gang. One Man Gang then hits a devastating splash on Conan in the middle of the ring, but Conan ultimately hits a senton off the top rope on One Man Gang, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match, and still at that time WCW United States Heavyweight Champion, is Conan. Hats off to Conan for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a strap match. It is Brian Pillman versus the Taskmaster. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Pillman and the Taskmaster. Pillman ends up grabbing a microphone, tells Sullivan that he's leaving the ring, or Taskmaster that he's leaving the ring. Pillman then walks away from the match, and your winner of the match is the Taskmaster. Taskmaster. After that, Arn Anderson makes his way down to the ring. Taskmaster then challenges Arn Anderson. Arn then unloads on the Taskmaster. Turns into a back and forth matchup. Flair makes his way down to the ring. Flair asks the referee to stop the match. Flair then grabs a microphone and says that he wants to end Hulkamania, and the best way to do that is have the 4 Horsemen and the Dungeon of Doom team up together to take down Hogan and Randy Savage. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is the Road Warriors versus Lex Luger and Sting. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Lex and Sting keeping the pace of the match. But this match ultimately ends in a double countout. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship in a steel cage match. It is Ric Flair versus Macho Man Randy Savage. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Savage, with Flair keeping the pace of the match. Flair and Randy both exchange in the middle of the ring, with Flair landing devastating chops on Randy. Flair then sends Randy face first into the cage wall. Flair then hits the referee. Referee is knocked down. Randy then applies a figure 4 leg lock on Flair, but the hold is broken. Flair then applies a figure four of his own on Randy, but the hold is also broken as well. Miss Elizabeth is ringside. She ends up handing Ric Flair one of her shoes. Flair then hits Randy with Miss Elizabeth's shoes. Flair then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time, new WCW World Heavyweight Champion is the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Hats off to the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our main event of Super Brawl 1996. It is the Giant versus Hulk Hogan in a steel cage matchup. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between the Giant and Hogan, with Giant keeping the pace of the match. Hogan lands multiple leg drops on Giant. Giant gets right back up. Giant and Hogan both exchange on the top rope. Hogan then knocks off the Giant. Hogan then climbs over the cage, touches the floor, and your winner of the match is Hulk Hogan. A couple of things I'm going to say about Super Brawl 1996, man, before I get out of here. It was an okay event. I'm not going to say it was the worst, but was it lackluster? Absolutely. Absolutely. A couple of things I'm going to take away from the event is Johnny B. Bad versus DDP, number one. Number one, is it a solid match? Yeah, it's a solid match. But I think the thing with Johnny B. Bad, and I stated this multiple times in the past about Johnny B. Bad, is that, was WCW pushing Johnny B. Bad in the beginning? Yes, they were. But with that being said, 9 times out of 10, Johnny B. Bad wrestled the same guy consistently for, weeks to months on end. I mean, it seemed like every pay-per-view he was facing the same person for 2 to 3 straight pay-per-views because they had nobody else, to book him against. Now, I get it, long-term booking, long-term storylines, but I also get to the point where it's like, all right, well, maybe you're draining that storyline to nothing. And that's literally what I'm starting to feel like when it comes to the Johnny B. Bad and DDP situation. Now, credit, a lot of the storyline was based on the Diamond Doll, which was Kimberly Page, and Johnny B. Bad ended up winning her services in the match against DDP, and now, Diamond Doll was now pretty much associating herself with Johnny B. Bad. Then there was the, $6 million, challenge that he won and got the big check from DDP and all this other stuff. But, more times than not, it seemed like Johnny B. Bad wrestled the same guy for multiple pay-per-views. And it just drains the storyline, in my honest opinion. The Nasty Boys versus Public Enemy was the first match of this card. It was great to see Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge in WCW. And this was a part of the, in ECW's time, unfortunately, that, Eric Bischoff and WCW were, plucking a lot of ECW talent that they had, whether it was Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Psychosis, Public Enemy, Raven, and I've stated this multiple times in the past about ECW as well. People can say what they want about ECW. The fact of the matter is, what Paul Heyman created in, South Philly and ECW was nothing less than, inspirational. It was absolutely insane, man. It was one of those things where, you had the traditional wrestling where it was, you had the NWA, you had WCW, you had WWF, and it was more traditional, where when ECW came into the fold and really got, popular, it was, extreme championship wrestling. It brought the hardcore element into professional wrestling. And what better place to have that in its birthplace to be none other than, Philadelphia, which was absolutely fantastic. The Philly crowd, Philly absolutely loved ECW, myself included. But yeah, it was a hotbed for talent. There's no and buts bit about it. I mean, Chris Benoit wrestled for ECW. Eddie Guerrero wrestled for ECW. Rey Mysterio, Psychosis, Raven, Public Enemy. Sandman, he also wrestled for WCW under the name of Hack. Mike Awesome, hardcore legend in himself, had a lot of good matches in FMW as well as ECW, especially when it was Mike Awesome versus Tanaka. Fantastic matches. Absolutely fantastic matches. So, to see Public Enemy in WCW in this match especially, it was one of those things where you can tell that, ECW eventually was going to fold. And it's not just based upon Public Enemy. I mean, like I said, it was a hotbed for talent. Whether it was WWE, pretty much poaching talent from ECW, or Eric Bischoff poaching talent from ECW as well. It was a hotbed for talent. And some of the talent that came through those doors in ECW, man, were absolutely insane. insane talent. So it's great to see Public Enemy in WCW. Like I said, I pretty much touched base on the Johnny B. Bad situation with DDP. Conan, it was great to see Conan in WCW at this point. I think he made his WCW debut at Super Bowl in 1996, if I'm not mistaken. And, he had a really decent run, I would say, with the WCW United States Heavyweight Championship. So it was great to see Conan in the ring for WCW. Brian Pillman and the Taskmaster. This was a situation that was actually documented, I believe, in one of those documentaries about Brian Pillman, that Pillman was trying to do whatever he could to get over with the WCW crowd, especially, management. Brian Pillman wanted more money in his contract that he wasn't getting. And he wanted a main event spot where Brian Pillman was more or less a mid-card guy. To be quite honest, I'm not taking anything away from Brian Pillman. I think he's a great wrestler. He's a great athlete. He's great on the microphone. I mean, some of the best promos in the business have come from Brian Pillman. But with that being said, as far as a main event caliber status for Brian Pillman, at least in that day was, when he was teaming up with Steve Austin, when they were the Hollywood Blondes. I think that was his best bet to whether have main event or co-main event, stature in a pay-per-view. I don't think, Pillman would have done that on his own. Now, again, it's not me taking anything away from Pillman, but I don't think WCW or Eric Bischoff at that time really saw a whole lot into Brian Pillman, and they weren't really willing to invest so much money into Pillman at that time because I think they felt like Pillman really couldn't bring them a lot of money. Now, there has been speculation about Bischoff, letting Pillman go and went over to WWE to try to make a name for himself, and then, once his contract was up with WWE, Pillman would have came back into WCW, and Bischoff probably would have gave him the money that he was asking for, but unfortunately, under the circumstances, Brian Pillman ended up passing away, and, that whole situation between, Bischoff and Pillman for WCW never really happened, but, at the same time, too, we all know what happened at WCW. They were eventually bought out. A lot of wrestlers ended up leaving. They weren't happy. The booking was horrible towards the end of WCW's run, towards 99 to 2001, so I don't know really who benefited out of that whole thing as far as the contract's concerned between Eric Bischoff or Brian Pillman. But all in all, the Pillman match versus Taskmaster, it was interesting, especially having Pillman leave. It was all part of the loose cannon gimmick. He was just trying to get himself over to make more money and stay with WCW at that time, in my honest opinion. Road Warriors versus Luger and Sting. It was a solid matchup. I'm not going to sit here and praise it. Could have been a hell of a lot better than what it was, but unfortunately it wasn't. But the match ended up ending in a double countout. Ric Flair versus Randy Savage for the World Heavyweight Championship. It was a solid match, man. It was a really good matchup. And it was one of those moments, especially, with Randy walking down to the ring with Miss Elizabeth. And you have Flair walking down to the ring with Woman. And then seeing Miss Elizabeth hype up Randy during this entire match. At least towards the end. And then, Miss Elizabeth kind of turning heel. And then handing Randy Savage one of her heels, and Randy used that in the match to get the victory over Randy Savage. I don't think a lot of people would have saw that coming, especially, the tie that Elizabeth had to Randy throughout Randy's, career. A lot of Randy's, in-ring career was tied to the hip with Miss Elizabeth. I think they both kind of made each other. I mean, a lot of people back in the day, were more fans of Miss Elizabeth than Randy. Because, a lot of people loved Randy, but I think Randy, when it pertained to Miss Elizabeth in the early days of WWE, Randy was a heel. In my honest opinion, I mean, the matches that he had, whether it was George the Animal Steel, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat at WrestleMania 3, Randy was a heel. And the main reason why Randy was a heel was because his persona, the way he was, and how he was towards Miss Elizabeth on screen. So, seeing them two, and even in WCW, and having Miss Elizabeth kind of turn heel on Randy, I thought was great. It was probably one of those things where, after so many years of, on camera, of Randy being a heel and being nasty towards Miss Elizabeth, Miss Elizabeth finally got even with Randy and, turned her back on Randy and allowed Flair, get the win on him after so many years of all that, grief that she was getting from Randy in the early days of WWE or WWF. So, it was wild to see that, man. It told a hell of a story, and I don't think anybody at that time would have saw Miss Elizabeth turn her back on the Macho Man Randy Savage, but we saw that in that match. And then the main event, we had the Giant versus Hulk Hogan. And The couple things I took away from this matchup, especially on commentary, I think it was Bobby Heenan, Tony Schiavone, and the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. And you hear Tony Schiavone, obviously hyping up the Giant and saying that, the Giant is, the son of Andre the Giant, and he's trying to, rewrite his father's legend when it comes to the Giant facing Hogan. But in hindsight, they were just doing that because of the Giant's size. It wasn't like Andre was the father of the Giant, Paul White. It just didn't happen. And, looking back on it now, it's like, man, if people had internet back then and they were trying to sell this whole gimmick with, the Giant being the son of Andre, it would have bit them right back. They'd be like, wow, this storyline makes no absolute sense. And I guess it kind of worked out in their favor a little bit. But because, at the end of the day, there really wasn't many dirt sheets that people were available, it wasn't available to the common fan to get the dirt sheets on what really the hell was going on with some of these storylines like we do now. Now, there's Twitter, there's Instagram, there's, different podcasts out there that are getting, giving people information about these storylines that they have, behind the scenes news that a lot of the, casual fan don't have. So, WCW was walking a fine line back then, but they could because, nobody really had that information or really was looking into it as much as a lot of fans are now. So, and a lot of fans are a lot more invested, I think, in the product than they were back then. You know what I mean? And especially more critiquing it, if anything else. But the Giant and Hogan, it was, like I said, it was an okay match. It was one of those things where it was a time where Giant came in. They were really hyping up the Giant. He was a part of the Dungeon of Doom with Kevin Sullivan. And I think Kevin Sullivan kind of took, the Giant underneath his wing for a while. And was the Giant underrated? Yeah. His WCW run was great. Do I think it was better than his WWE run? Yeah, I do. And that might be hard to understand for most people, but I think, quality of match that Paul White had, obviously he was a lot younger than when he got into WWE when he debuted. I believe he debuted at the Valentine's State Massacre or something like that for WWE when I think Vince was going up against Steve Austin in a cage match, and then Paul White debuted by throwing Steve Austin into the cage and allowing Austin to win the match because the whole side of the wall of the cage ended up opening and Austin fell to the floor and got the win over Vince. I believe that's how he debuted, but Giant had a hell of a run in WCW. A lot of memorable moments. I remember when Goldberg came in, and not a lot of people really suplexed the Giant with a vertical suplex in the middle of the ring, but Goldberg, I remember he pulled that off. Whether it was on the first time he did it on Nitro or it was Road Wild or Hog Wild or one of those pay-per-views, but I do remember the vertical suplex that he hit on the Giant, and the crowd went absolutely insane. And, a little sidebar, too, about WCW before I get out of here, man. I think one of the biggest things, and I still talk about this to this day, is when Goldberg was going after Hogan for the World Heavyweight Championship. This is when Hogan was obviously in the NWO, when he was Hollywood Hogan. They ended up putting that match on a regular Nitro in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, obviously Goldberg has a lot of, allegiance to Atlanta. He played college football in Atlanta. I believe he even played or tried out for the Atlanta Falcons. He has a lot of ties to Atlanta. And to have that, I believe it was in the Georgia Dome, is where they had WCW. It was a full house. If you would have put that on a pay-per-view, it would have sold like hotcakes. And they didn't. And Goldberg was also a part of another match. I believe it was Halloween Havoc. I don't know exactly what year, but I know his opponent was Diamond Dallas Page. And, there was controversy with that because the feed of the match between Goldberg and DDP actually cut out. And nobody really knew the end of the match. And WCW had to refund a lot of people's money, that year in that pay-per-view because they didn't get the finish because the feed cut out. So, WCW wasn't the greatest. And don't get me wrong, I'm not, obviously big on gimmick matches. And WCW had probably some, if not the worst gimmick matches of all time. The Judy Bagwell on a forklift match. If you guys know WCW, some of those gimmick matches were absolutely horrendous. But as far as a rating for WCW Super Brawl 1996, I'm going to have to give Super Brawl 1996 a solid rating of a 5 at best, man. Like I said, it wasn't the worst pay-per-view I've ever seen, but it wasn't the best. Absolutely not. There were some things that definitely could have been changed, and some things that were good. It was good to see Public Enemy. It was great to see Conan as well in the ring. But the card was very weak, man. It was very lackadaisical in my opinion. And, they could have done a hell of a lot better with booking this card, in my honest opinion. So that's the reason why I'm giving Super Brawl 1996 a solid rating of a 5 at best. But this is my review of WCW Super Brawl 1996. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.